Good morning. I am Dan Utso, the Managing Director of the Canada-United States Law Institute. On behalf of the Institute, our Executive Committee, Advisory Board, and our two founding institutions, Case Western Reserve University School of Law and the University of Western Ontario Faculty of Law, I welcome you to the 28th Annual Henry T. King Jr. Annual Conference on Canada-United States Relations. For those of you that are first-timers, the bell is a tradition that dates back to that first conference, and you will be hearing that throughout this weekend's proceedings. I've already broken one of Henry's long-standing rules. We are running a bit behind this morning, but our panels are built with a little bit of squish time, so we won't tell you the method to our madness, but that is there. I do want to point out a few nuts and bolts issues for everyone. Things are a little bit different this year, particularly for those of you that have been here over many years in some cases, coming to this conference. The first is, please ensure that you wear your name tag throughout the proceedings. There's a very important reason for that. It's because we have a law school of about 600 students that love to eat the food. So if people see, if you're not wearing your name tag, you will be shooed away and assume that you are a student, notwithstanding any of your appearances. Secondly, I refer you to the goodie bag that you've received, the black bag from Connect to Canada and our colleagues at the Canadian Embassy in Washington. Included in this are a number of informational materials from Positively Cleveland, our convention and trade bureau here in the great state of Ohio and northeastern Ohio in particular, but also the updated conference agenda, speakers, where you need to be, and most importantly, our conference sponsors are listed in the materials. If you have any questions during the proceedings, please you can see a number of our students here. There's also an overflow room across the way where they are camped out. Our students will be in and out of that room throughout the day. We also have a talented professional team, our administrative team, out in the front that you've seen this morning, Nancy Pratt, Alice Simon, and Jared Gregory, who if you have any questions, comments, concerns, those are the people to talk to, as well as myself, in terms of getting you in the right place at the right time today. They're here to help. They've been engaged with this conference night and day for about the past year. So with that, I'll refer you to them for any questions. I want to thank two people in particular for organizing this conference. Our two conference co-chairs, Chris Sands of the Hudson Institute and David Crane, a syndicated journalist in Toronto, who have dedicated essentially the past year of their lives to organizing this conference. Many of you have been on the receiving end of those phone calls asking you to come and speak or participate, and without them, this conference would not be possible. So thank you, Chris and David. And beyond that, we have a talented advisory board that just met this morning, actually because they are so active. We're a little bit late on starting this morning, but that is led by our executive committee. Many of our members of our executive committee you will meet throughout the conference and we'll be introducing throughout the proceedings, but our two executive committee co-chairs are the driving force behind the Institute, and it is my great privilege and even greater pleasure to introduce our co-chairs, Minister James Peterson of Fasken Martineau. Minister, I think you may have stepped out for, excuse me, all right, how could I miss? And Governor James Blanchard, and if I can invite Governor Blanchard if you're going to say a few words this morning.
Let's start with Jim Peterson.
Well, let me say this. I couldn't be more honored to be the co-chair of this with Jim Blanchard. I met Jim when he was appointed the ambassador of the United States to Canada, and kept in touch ever since. I must tell you this, thank you. In all the years that I have been involved in the Canada-U.S. relationship, Jim Blanchard brought more to it than any of his predecessors or successors. Back in 1995, Canada was embroiled, as many of you know, in the issue of separation of Quebec. And the polls were looking very bad for keeping Canada united on the eve of the referendum. In international relations, one knows there is a law that you can never interfere in the internal matters of another state. Jimmy broke that rule and brought President Clinton to the House of Commons in Ottawa where he talked about the need for a strong, united Canada to the north of the United States. We won it by about 51,000 votes, and that was what did it. So, Jimmy, you have done more for our country than anybody else in this room ever had done or ever will do, and it's just great to be working with you here at Coolsley, a unique institution, one where we together have the opportunity to build that incredible relationship between the two closest neighbors and the two closest friends on the earth. Dan, you have done a remarkable job, you and everybody else, in making this happen. I'm very thankful to you, and I think we're going to see the results of your incredible efforts at this conference, which is attended by so many people. We welcome you, we thank you for being here, and we look forward to your participation not only today, but in the future of this unique institution in the history of our two great countries.
Thank you, Minister. Governor, did you have a few words?
I'd give my left arm for Cusley, I'll tell you that.
Jim Peterson read that just the way I wrote it. Oh, I could listen to you all day, Jim. Now, he's
My wife would say that.
yeah. My mother loved, anyway. Welcome all of you. I've worked with Jim, as you can probably tell, for a long time, and as you know, he served with distinction in the Cabinet of Canada. He's been a member of Parliament, or was now a member of Parliament, for many, many years, and actually was a real live practicing lawyer, a tax lawyer. As I recall, you actually taught in a law school, isn't that correct? So we have a real live bona fide lawyer and academic, as well as a distinguished diplomat and trade minister for Canada. I want to echo what you said, though, about Dan. Dan has been the real mainstay of this institute. We appreciate all of your work, and I was glad that you mentioned that we ought to also acknowledge Nancy Pratt, Alice Simon, and Jared Gregory for their work. They're probably outside in the hallway worrying about registrants and other things, but these kind of conferences don't just happen by sending out mailers. They don't. And I want to thank our executive committee as well, especially my partner, Rick Newcomb, who helped rope me into this role. I appreciate it. But our executive committee has spent a lot of time worrying about what our future is, what our mandate is, what our mission is. And so that's important. But to Dan, and also to the consulate, the Canadian consulate in Detroit, how much we appreciate their leadership and support. Roy Norton will be here sometime today. You'll see him, the Consul General. George Casteras is here somewhere. Where is George? George has been the kind of the memory bank and the brain box for that consulate since 1982. And we appreciate your leadership, George. I see also the former Consul General, John Tennant, is here. So it's a delight to see you again. And how much we enjoyed working with you. We also have a distinguished judge here, a bankruptcy judge. It's Randolph Baxter is here, so that is great to have a little judicial presence with us. I want to give a special welcome to some of the newer participants as well. I can't list all of you, but I'm very pleased we have a couple of law firms from Michigan, Dickinson Wright, Miller Canfield, and MSU, Michigan State University here, as well as my friends from Enbridge and Spectra. You're going to hear from Al Monaco later, but we're really pleased to have, and there are other companies I know you will acknowledge to make sure how much we value their participation. Let me just say it's an interesting time. We were joking earlier about Canada has an election, and so Ambassador Dewar felt that he couldn't come here and talk for fear that someone would interpret something he said that might affect the election. He's a wonderful ambassador for Canada to the U.S., but you are going to hear from his counterpart, our good friend, David Jacobson. You'll hear from him tonight, the U.S. ambassador to Canada, a fabulous guy, also an extremely successful lawyer from Chicago, who then was the deputy finance chair for Barack Obama and a very close friend of Barack Obama. and his entire team. So I'm really happy to have him here with us tonight. I should also say that amidst threats of shutdown and the election in Canada, the fact is, you know, Canada-U.S. Relations continue to grow and expand. This past year, trade grew between the two countries 21%. By the way, trade with Ohio grew, this is back Canada-Ohio, 29% from last year, 2010 back to 2009. Trade between Canada and Michigan grew 44%, which is, by the way, why we need a new publicly governed bridge 2 miles south of the current Ambassador Bridge, which indeed will happen thanks to our new governor in Michigan, who is strongly supportive. But what is often lost, not on Canadians as much as Americans, is the energy relationship, which is incredible. It is powerful. It is all-encompassing. It isn't just Hydro-Quebec or electricity, and of course we know when the grid shut down what happened, or uranium, but oil and gas, and we're going to hear a lot about that, and renewables, and a number of our speakers are going to talk about this. I mean, Canada has been the largest provider of oil to the United States for years, somewhat more than Saudi Arabia, and that can grow and grow and grow if we want it to, if we have the right policies. And the same is true of natural gas, although with the new shale plays, it's hard to know exactly how that will play out. Maybe Al Monaco will talk about that. But this energy relationship is key, enough so that in the first trip that Barack Obama made to Ottawa, they talked about, among other things, oil sands, but the need for a clean energy dialogue, and to work together on research and development and technology, to work together on developing new sources of energy, to work together on carbon capture and sequestration, all these different issues. So we're going to be focusing on that because even though there's probably an energy conference every week in every state, and at least one a week in Washington, D.C., there's been precious little about whether we don't need some sort of jointly harmonized, synchronized climate change policy with Canada and the U.S. together. Because I don't see how anyone's going to legislate or regulate or pontificate on these issues in isolation. And this is probably true of Mexico as well, although the major relationships we're talking about today are Canada and the U.S. So that's kind of the genesis of this conference. And of course, we're very lucky to have Chris Sands and David Crane to co-chair this and give it the intellectual energy and the pizzazz and the prestige that we feel the subject deserves. So I want to thank you as well, and thank everyone else. And I guess my job now is to turn this over to Chris Sands. Yes, Dan? Yes, all right, thank you. And Chris, thanks.
Welcome, everybody. It is a great honor to be at my second CUSLA meeting, and already I've been dragooned into doing program co-chairing, which is a sign of just how influential our leadership is. They twist arms gently but firmly, and so I couldn't help but want to get involved. And David Crane, my conference co-chair, and I are in the fortunate position. David is a syndicated journalist that you most likely are reading every week, every day. Me as a think tank guy, we have lots of time to go to conferences, lots of time to attend interesting talks. And so as a result, what we've tried to do with this program is give you sort of a best of, a greatest hits of some of the most interesting thinkers, some of the most provocative people, to really move this forward, not as a basic primer that tells you what you already know, but bringing in people who can really tell you where policy thinking is going, where the issues are moving, where the technology is moving, so that you can be 2 or 3 steps ahead of most people who follow issues as important as energy and the environment. As most of you know, one of the first Canada-U.S. agreements between our two countries was to set up the Boundary Waters Treaty in 1909, which gave us the International Joint Commission and an ability to regulate shared waterways. The environment brought us together from the very beginning. And we found ourselves trading in the natural resources, including coal, that helped to power our cities and run our steam engines and so on. The very beginning of this relationship was an exchange of energy and a recognition that the environment, no matter how much we'd like to put up the 49th parallel or other borders, simply crossed the border whether we liked it or not. And it raised 2 very important issues. The challenge of coming up with better energy to fuel our growing economies in the industrial age and beyond, and at the same time, the need for shared governance of those flows that cross the border also, whether we like it or not. And we have been at this now for some time. The issues today, because of the importance of climate change, because of the importance of our new energy opportunities, bring us back together. And I think the people who should be on the cutting edge of this are you all, the members of CUSLE. You'll see from the program today a real smattering of just about all the major issues. We're looking at the future of fossil fuels, coal, natural gas, coal to liquids, as well as oil and cleaner oil. We're taking a look at electricity and the electricity grid. We're taking a look here at regulatory systems from carbon taxes to cap and trade and where the future might take us. We're looking at the interaction of the two systems between Canada and the United States and how our interaction can either compete or bring us together. We'll take a look at some of the new thinking on commercial freight and what we could do to address a particular sector. We'll look at the roles of states and provinces. This is not just federal. And we'll try to make sure that they're given their due, and we'll look at where they may be innovating and showing the way. So it's an exciting program. We're very pleased to have had that chance to pull it together for you. We want your feedback as well, and you'll see David and I throughout the conference. Please let us know what you think is working, what you'd like to see included, and we'll make sure that all gets back to the future. So with that, let me just stop and introduce my very distinguished, more distinguished than me, co-chair for the program, David Crane, to introduce the first panel.
Thanks, Chris. I have a chance as a moderator in the next panel to say a few words. So all I will say now about the conference, which Chris has summarized very well, is what we really hope to do is to explain why there's such a huge gap between what we know and what we do in our societies, because that's what energy policy is really all about. And how do we close that gap? We have a lot of information, a lot of data, a lot of scientific and technological information, and yet we seem to be finding it very hard to take that information and change the things we do. So as I say, our challenge is to try to understand why there is this gap between what we know and what we do, and how do we close it. Thanks.
Don't sit down just yet, David. I would invite our first panel down to the podium, Carl, Meera, and David, if they could come to the moot court bench. I do have, while they're coming down, did you want to? Just in terms of nuts and bolts, I do welcome the audience that's viewing this on webcast, both watching this from throughout the continent. With that in mind, this is being recorded for various purposes. Again, broadcast live. It will be used online for both CUSLE, the Ohio Bar Association, et cetera. Please, one key difference from past conferences is during the Q&A, it's important. The microphones will not move around the room. If you have a question, you do have to come to the standing mics. Please, for the purposes of court reporting, you can see everything is on the record, so to speak. So if you could just say your name and your affiliation. If you have a funny last name, something not unknown to me, please, you may want to give a spelling there as well. And in the vein that everything is on the record, in your materials, you have the most up-to-date, hot-off-the-press version of the Canada United States Law Journal, which is last year's edited proceedings and some student work that has been published. So we encourage you to review this. Again, this will be published. These proceedings will be published. And we welcome the many students from Case Western Reserve, as well as our guests here from the University of Western Ontario that have traveled, and you can see those faces throughout. I note that this is getting into finals times for our students, so this you may see people studying furiously while they're listening, but we do welcome our students, and this is part of our overall program here at Case Western Reserve and the University of Western Ontario. So with that, I'll turn it over to David Crane.
Dan, what time do you want us to finish at?
10:30.
Big one?
10:30.
10:30. Okay.
I'm sorry, Governor, you had something as well.
No, only that when we get the transcript of the proceedings and the speakers will be allowed to edit to make sure that we didn't mishear what was said. We will then try to do this in a timely fashion. We will share it with our government leaders on both sides of the border and try to actually get them to read it as well. So that we'll have some legs.
Absolutely. Thank you, Governor. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome everybody to this panel. We have two very distinguished panelists who I know will help us launch this day and a half of discussion. I'd just like to start off, though, by making 2 or 3 comments to provide a little bit of context which went into our thinking as we started the conference. And first of all, to underline the point that energy is about much more than just energy. It's about national security. It has to do with the exposure of our electrical systems to acts of terrorism. It's about exchange rates and currencies. It's about industrial restructuring and the impact on jobs and growth and inflation. It's about capital flows. It's about the environment, and especially climate change and clean air. It's about research and development policy. It's about economic philosophy. Do you believe in just letting markets decide how these things will be settled, or a more interventionist type of policy? It's about foreign policy, and it's about competition between evidence-based findings and ideology. And so it's more than just about what we put in our gas tank or what turns on the light each day. Now, it's very interesting that the U.S. trade deficit last year, oil accounted for more than 50% of the trade deficit. I mean, everybody focuses on China, and there's a lot of China bashing that goes on. But if the U.S. really wanted to improve its current account situation, it could be much more effective by addressing the issue of oil imports. And if we look at the price of oil today, over $100 a barrel, at the IMF and many of the economic policy making groups, the assumption is that going forward, oil is going to remain above $100 a barrel. That's very expensive. It has huge implications. This year, for the first time, it's estimated that OPEC's export revenues will exceed $1 trillion. Think of that going forward. Year after year, the OPEC countries generating more than $1 trillion in export revenues, what that's going to mean for financial markets, for exchange rates, for capital flows, all of these kinds of things. It has huge implications for the US dollar and its future role. We have issues about climate change, and how do you deal with climate change if so much electricity is coming from coal and we're relying so heavily on oil. In a way, and this brings me to Canada, the issues of energy policy and climate change have fallen a bit off the headline radar. In our election campaign, which is underway now, there's virtually no discussion of energy policy or climate change. Nobody wants to talk about it. I think that's partly an outcome of the serious recession that we've been through. And so we've been much more focused on how do we prevent the next Great Depression, how do we restructure our banking systems, and now how do we deal with the ongoing problems of unemployment and fiscal deficits and these kinds of things. But the climate change issue is going to come back. There's no question about that. Canada's constitution affects the way we discuss energy in Canada, because electricity, for the most part, is a provincial matter. In Ontario, we're going to have an election this fall. Electricity will be a huge issue. Pricing, the role of nuclear power, the role of renewables, all of these things are going to be very much in front of stage, but they're not an issue in the federal campaign. Likewise, oil and gas policy, royalties, pace of development, these kinds of things are largely in the hands of governments in Alberta and British Columbia and Saskatchewan. The federal government role is limited to interprovincial, international dimensions, and so that's important in the Canada-US context, and it's affected by how the federal government changes the corporate tax system to provide incentives or credits on energy development and renewables. Nonetheless, the energy is becoming more of an issue in Canada. Like Australia, there's growing concern that our economy is changing, and that we're devoting ourselves basically to digging stuff out of the ground and shipping it to another country, and without capturing much of the value added out of that. This has a big impact on our exchange rate. Our exchange rate is now 103 US cents. A few years ago, it was 65 US cents. That's a huge change in our exchange rate. It has dramatic implications for the future of Ontario's manufacturing sector, and the Bank of Canada has finally acknowledged that this is a serious challenge for Canada going forward. And if oil stays at above $100 a barrel, and there's tremendous pressure to pump out as much oil as possible to meet U.S. needs, then our exchange rate is going to remain very high. There's also a question that has emerged. Some of you may have read about the Keystone Pipeline issue and whether or not the United States will permit a pipeline to take oil sands oil down to refineries in the Gulf of Mexico to refine that. But in Canada, there's another issue, and that is, why aren't we doing the refining in Canada? Why aren't we capturing that extra value in Canada instead of sending a raw material to the U.S. to be refined in the United States, and where a lot of those high technology jobs will be? Anyway, those are some of the points I wanted to raise. Just to give a little bit of context, and I was to emphasize the point that energy is important in terms of we need energy, but energy is also important in a variety of macroeconomic dimensions that we also have to take into account. We have many technological opportunities which we will hear about. In the short term, we can look at compressed natural gas and liquid natural gas for highway traffic and for city fleets. That can take some pressure off oil demand. There is a question of shale gas, whether it's environmentally feasible. I see that the French government is considering a ban on shale gas development in that country, and in the province of Quebec, the provincial government has put a stop, at least for the time being, on any development of shale gas in that province because they're concerned about the environmental impact on drinking water supplies. We still have hydrogen as a longer-term opportunity in electricity, smart metering, but to really realize the benefits, it seems to me we have to get fiber to the home at some point to do this. We have challenges in electricity storage. We're building all this wind and solar power. Can we store that electricity that when it's not needed? There are still gains in energy efficiency, and carbon capture storage is an interesting technology, but still has big hurdles to overcome in costs, efficiency, and concerns over public safety. And we have also the emerging challenge, controversy on biofuels development versus food supply. So these are all kinds of issues. So we have two very good speakers to speak to us today, starting with Carl Brewer, who has, I think, can bring us a lot of useful insight into the technology side and the choices we face there. And so I think if we start with you, Carl, and then we'll come to your presentation after that. And we'd like to wrap this up a little after 10:30, so we've got roughly an hour.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and look very much to this gathering. Nice to have a smaller audience to have a little more intimate exchange. The challenge given to me to come and speak was to try to stimulate conversation. So I may push the envelope a little bit of comfort, and I'm not going to tell you the answers. I'll tell you some questions. I'm a great believer that asking the right questions is very important to getting the right answers. Good answers to the wrong question aren't very useful, even though they're good answers. So with that, I'd like to go forward. One of the things was to speak about the Clean Energy Dialogue. As you know, it was started in February 2009, and it was basically aimed at climate change, greenhouse gas. So by that definition, clean energy is about greenhouse gas and CO2. There's been quite a few meetings. Action plans have been developed. And in the action plans, there's 20 some odd things that are going on, but you can put them together in basically 4 categories. Strategic demonstration projects of carbon capture and carbon sequestration, projects to get an understanding at full scale or large scale on what it takes to do it and how hard is it, experiments. Those are going on. There were a lot of initial starts and false starts, and there's some that are going on fairly readily now, but still, expenses are even higher than people expected in the beginning, and many have fallen off from that. But they've also been useful, and since many of you are lawyers, this is probably good news. If you remember the Clean Air Act, it was a decade of opportunity for the legal profession to argue the things in court and set up many institutions that now exist. And I think we'll see the same thing here as we argue about pore space and rights and march-in rights and eminent domain. And I suppose one person doesn't want to let them have the pore space. How do you deal with that? And those things are happening. The alignment of key regulatory standards is another area which I think would be important. I do agree with the observations of the introductory speakers that it would be good if we could agree with each other about how we regulate certain things so we could have some uniformity of acceptance and discussion. And in fact, basically, if you haven't noticed, the CO2 either goes north or south depending on how the wind blows, so it's very hard to just put the wall up and say, we'll deal with it this way. If you remember the acid rain discussions, there was a lot of argument about that too. I'm giving away my age, I guess, but collaborative R&D, that's happening. The intellectual property arguments continue to be an issue, so the basic research is fairly good exchange and published, but there's a great concern about intellectual property, and so anybody who's spending their own money to invent something or have a good idea doesn't necessarily want to lose the upside of that good idea. That also becomes an issue internationally as we try to work with the Chinese and other countries that have large growths in carbon-producing electricity so that they would not necessarily come back and sell us the invention we made at a lower price and we could afford to make it ourselves. And finally, public awareness and outreach. That's there, quite frankly, my opinion is that's probably the area that the weakest amount of results have taken place. If you think about David's introductory comments, why are we talk one way and do other things? A large reason is, and why is it not part of the electoral discussion? It's because the general population hasn't really come on board one way or the other. We have some that argue one way, some that argue the other, but there's a large mass in the middle that aren't sure which way, and they're not even sure if they care which way, quite frankly, because economically, it's a very important issue to them, only from the standpoint of price. So where are they on the dialogue? Working groups have been established and they're communicating. I guess I'd sum it up, and there are some things that come out that we read. 2 years later, 3 years later, we are still in a good conversation, as is often the case. I would say there's one other observation I would share, which I think really needs to be remedied if you want to have success, and that largely, and I forget which one of, might have been you, Governor, but spoke to the fact that industry is who owns the energy space. Who puts their capital into it? Who puts the energy efforts together? Who puts the labor force together? It's not governments. Governments regulate, they stimulate, they put policy in place to encourage or discourage certain things, and those all have effects and are essential, and especially some certainty. But in the United States and Canada, largely the big money that causes things to happen in the energy world is from industry, and if you don't bring them to the party in a more meaningful way, you get where we are, which is the very dynamics, we'll call it politely, of lobbying and other things that go on to inform various voting members of what's important, what's not important, as well as they're probably doing a better job of communicating than anybody else. And so there's those things that happen. So that's not bad or good. It's the way our societies were set up to operate. But it is a difficult thing, and I really suggest that we find a better way to have industry and their needs and concerns more adequately addressed. So you kind of summed this slide up for me. I don't know, you can't see it, I guess, but it's a slide that I like to use to talk about strategy for energy. Yeah. And it may look awful simple, but basically there's three major categories, and David, you kind of mentioned them all three. Yeah. And the environmental and sustainability one is a combination of regulations and policy, and then the economics that cause those things to be met, which you go into the lower left-hand circle, the economic affordability or viability. Can you really afford what you want to do? You know, I drove up from where I live. I hate to tell you I live down near Pittsburgh because I want to get out of here today, but anyway, the reality is I wanted to drive a Maserati up here, but you know, I don't even have a Toyota. And I looked at my checkbook and I figured I'd drive the Toyota. Not because I didn't want a Maserati, because I did. And sometimes we forget about that. Supply security, and you touched on that because it's an international issue to each country. You know, the fact is that people want to use their energy and they buy it from Canada is very important for Canada's export and economy. It's a very important part of your GDP in Canada. It's also a very important part of the US GDP and also part of the trade deficit. It's also an issue about security because we have to do certain things because of it. And if you, probably not too many of you are old enough to remember Jimmy Carter, but you know, there was conversations back then that if there wasn't a further embargo of oil to the United States, that we would consider that an act of war and take appropriate measures. So that was all the bluster in the place. And that was a long time ago, and other presidents and others have had conversations like that, but it's the truth. So let's go on from there. Is greenhouse gas all clean energy is about? Is that really what clean energy is about, greenhouse gas? But that's what we've made it. And I think that's part of the reason it doesn't get the lift. Because if that's the case, then the people that don't believe greenhouse gas is the issue or the economics are justified aren't interested in clean energy because it's only about greenhouse gas. Right now, as you mentioned, central and federal governments discuss this, but the only real action about any kind of regulatory, I'll say, certainty or semi-certainty is coming out of the provinces and the states. Just this past week, there was an announcement came out that California and several other states on their borders have formed a carbon trading compact, and 3 western provinces of Canada are also actively looking at coming together and interested in that. And that might be a very interesting dynamic. The Northeast of the United States, we have the Regional Carbon Compact, sometimes called RGGI. That one's had its own dynamics if you follow the news. But the point is, it's not happening at the federal or central level. And that causes a real chill because now states have to do the same thing that countries do. States have to decide, is it going to be an economic handicap for them to put some kind of regulatory control on that raises the price of their energy? Because as you said, if you're a producing state of any kind of manufacturing or any kind of product, energy is a very important component and the cost is important. And the quality of life is driven by that. An interesting thing is if you look at countries that export energy as a large portion of their GDP, they don't necessarily get the true value of the energy in this sense. As long as they have energy, they make a lot of money. We talked about OPEC. You mentioned how much trillions of dollars it might be this year. The prices stay up on oil. But if you've gone to any of the OPEC nations, while they spend that money very luxuriously, let's say, it's a great place to visit if you like Disneyland because it's kind of real time every day Disneyland, except for some of the rules if you violate have very downside consequences. But the reality is that's all they have. So they're either into finance or selling energy. They really don't produce any other product that someone's going to buy. Now, they're trying to remedy that. Same thing happens in the province or a state that's a large energy exporter. And now let's take Wyoming and California. Wyoming is an exporting state of energy. California is basically a net importer of energy substantially. But California takes the energy they buy and they add a value-added product and they make substantially greater profit on that energy investment than Wyoming does, which basically sends the raw energy there. So that's something to think about as we think about these things. The new issue is perhaps that is there going to be a nuclear power contribution to the clean energy? I don't think everybody thinks it's a clean energy anymore. By the way, I'm a nuclear engineer by my early activities in life, so I'm not an anti-nuke. But the reality is that Japan's pretty much shut down. The moratorium on German use of their plants is shut down. And to give you a sense of what that means, and a sense of renewable energy, Japan and Germany together are total nuclear power of about almost 16 gigawatts of electricity in the world supply. That's equivalent to 43% of 2010 renewable electricity world supply. But it's not 43% of electricity supply from nuclear power in the world. Why I say that is 2 things. One, it's a huge hurdle to overcome. 2 is it gives you an idea of how hard it is to get the renewable energy, electricity production, up to take a major load away from the world. Simplest way to think of it is if they're going to replace Japan and Germany's nuclear power in the next 12 months, we need 143% of the electricity we got last year from renewables in the world. I'm not saying in the United States, in the world. So that means they got to do 50% more almost than they did last year. Can they build it that fast? They can't even build it that fast. And of course, nuclear power plants and other plants take even longer to build. So my point is sometimes we have these discussions without, we are really good at talking about our vision and our desires, but we don't always plug into the reality of what it takes to deliver them. And I think it's time to talk about that someplace along the way and set up a chronological plan forward to do something that has a reality in it. If you're in building things, and I have been, you can talk about when you have to deliver, and you got to back off all the things you need to know to happen, and then forward load them and find out, can you meet the date, or what can you do to work around, or can you just say, hey, I can't take this contract because I can't deliver. I can't take the risk to make that delivery. Or I got to spend money to put in parallel paths so I have a chance. I think we have to do that. Right now, we've had this argument about clean energy replacing everything else without really looking at the realities both economically and actually just chronological time of what it takes to build and permit and everything to get there. And how can we either clear the pathway for the permitting process and clear the pathway for the materials? And think about this. With China's build-out, India's build-out, and now Japan's build-out, where is all the raw materials, the steel and other things going to come from? We don't make much of that anymore in this country. Now, some of the steel mills are coming back online in this country because of that situation, and that may be good news. So I'm just saying those are things that need to be thought about. Is it economically viable, and do we even have the money at any price? And then I wanted to mention that right now, I'm going to jump over the last two bullets to show them to you graphically. This is from BP's, but Exxon's and IEA's looks the same. The one on the left is basically OECD, or the developed nations, and how much energy they've used. The kind of line down the middle is 2010 to give you a reference point. And you can see projected outward, very little growth, about 6% to 2030 of energy consumption increase. Look at the non-OECDs. This year they develop more than we do. Next year, but by 2030, they need 68% more, or in other words, they're going to need 168% of what they used last year. So that has a lot of ramifications about what you're going to do. One is, they're going to be wanting to build stuff, they're going to get the materials, they're going to get everything they need, or they're going to pay for it and they can. Two is, we don't have a turnover or a stock that fast. You know, if you talk about stranded assets or you talk about corporate investments that have been made, those capital investments can't just be thrown away because the corporation loses value when you do that. So when you tell somebody they're going to shut down, if their financial model for a particular billion-dollar investment was that they amortize it or pay it off or write it down over 20 years, and 10 years through it you say, well, you can't use it anymore, you just messed up their entire balance sheet because everything was planned around certain things. And that has impact potentially to their stock and the value and the ability to get more money going forward. So we have a major issue on where does capital come from. By the way, the chart on the right, it shows by 2030 where the energy fuels are, if you will. And you might notice the top of the chart is renewables, and the lower three stripes are still fossil energy, and nuclear is the thin gold slice. And I don't know what that's going to mean now based on what's happened in Japan and all the world comment and emotion around it, but it will at least be delayed. Different way to look at the same thing, and I'm not going to cover that. So again, is greenhouse gas all clean energy is about? Is there anything we should consider besides? Renewable energy, local, regardless of the cost of where it created most efficiently? It's kind of what we've been doing. When a state or a province passes an RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard, they assume it's going to be met. Now, how it gets met, they kind of think because they want the green jobs in their province or state, it will be met locally. But it may not be practical to meet it locally. It may be more economically viable to bring it in by wire or pipeline or by truck, depending on whether it's ethanol or electricity or whatever. Well, how about then transmission? Should expensive transmission built be to move the renewable to where it is wanted from where it is most efficiently made? Well, you can see those first two bullets are kind of a trade-off discussion that maybe economics and other desires come into that discussion. But we aren't dealing with them very well. Because who pays for the transmission is the big issue right now, at least in the States, because they're all basically siting and regulation are all dealt with at the local level by and large, and the willingness for FERC to be able to do things has been pushed back in the court systems even after a law that was passed several years ago. So is electricity still the province and state managed issue, or is it a central or federal government issue? And what does that mean? Because it really, except when it's interstate, is really not a federal level in the United States, at least supposedly. And then I put down the fact, and I say fact, that water and energy are codependent. They are absolutely codependent. And the worst case example I can use is California, in the sense that in California, 10% of their electricity, 30% of their natural gas is spent on energy, on water rather. Cleaning the water, pumping the water, moving the water, and of course, they move the water from the northern part of the state to the lower part of the state, it's even higher. That's a large piece of their energy pie going for water. Should water impact energy choices? Should water, and David, you alluded to that when you talked about water and biofuels. Yeah. And I have a couple of charts on. So should water be a more active consideration in the clean energy discussion? Would that change it some from being purely CO2? I suspect it would. So there's a water energy nexus. I talk about this often. I won't belabor it here with you, but I just put a few slides in that I'll finish up with. This little cartoon basically doesn't have farmland in, but I will address that in a minute. But basically, you know, you need water to make any thermal energy, and I'll show you what that means in a minute. You need water for cooling it. You need water for drinking and for citizens to use. And you need energy to make the water available and move it around and clean it and reuse it. So withdrawal versus consumption. This is for the United States. Basically, this is the withdrawal of water for use. I say use and withdrawal. I didn't say consumption. So you can see that irrigation or agriculture and thermoelectric power production, which includes geothermal, solar thermal, nuclear thermal, which is the only way you use nuke right now, coal, natural gas combined cycle, the combined cycle of the natural gas plants uses water in the steam cycle. All those add up to that thermoelectric, and then you have the other areas. But how much is really consumed by those areas? In other words, consumes means I can't have it back until it rains and comes back to me in the groundwater, by the river, by the lake, or whatever, as compared to I just put it back in where I got it and somebody else could use it, although it's a little hotter. So you can see agriculture uses a lot, and that would be expected. But the other areas don't really use that much, so we might be able to manage our water more wisely and actually find some efficiencies in the economy of scale that would actually save energy and make more water available. That just goes what I already said about who uses the most in the thermal cycles. And it's really interesting that geothermal steam is basically the largest consumer of water when in its application. They're improving on that. And there's even a look at using CO2 as an alternative to water as a working fluid for geothermal. Water demand for biofuels, all this chart basically tries to say is, if you want 2 gallons of gasoline, it's one thing, that's the equivalent of 3 gallons of ethanol, and that takes between 2,000 and 4,000 gallons per bushel, and 1 bushel makes 3 gallons. You need a lot of water to grow corn to make ethanol. I'm not going to talk about the food offset, only to give you an anecdote that there was a decision I was informed about while I was in work at DOE 7, 8 years ago, where they were going to talk about ethanol and going to ethanol, and somebody said, well, you know, it's not going to be a food problem, and somebody said, well, we don't really use food corn for ethanol. I didn't say that. I come from a farming background, just in case you know. My brother's still a farmer. The point of the matter was, no, we don't use sweet corn for ethanol. That's true. But, you know, we do use what's called sometimes field corn or cattle corn for corn syrup, you know, corn muffin, corn, you know, if you like grits, you know, all those things and many other things. And if you look how much is used, when you look at it that way, it's a huge issue. And by the way, it's also in tortillas and other things. So it shows how having the wrong information can lead to the wrong conclusions. And it's very important to have informed decision makers. So back to the original chart, and I'll be done. Is energy strategy. Now, what's changed on this chart besides putting a bullseye where we try to have the most amount of overlap so we can make the best decisions? And how we do it. If you remember the first chart, the arrows on each circle were pointing away because each, just like us, we all like to be in charge of our own lives. Every circle wants to move away and be in charge. And frankly, for the last 2 decades, environmental has been largely in charge and driven the train. I'm not saying that's bad or good. I'm just saying that is. That's been our biggest concern. But the reality is we ought to be trying to drive those circles together so we have more choices. So sometimes we'll be more in the economics issue than maybe the supply security issue, but if we're in the overlap issue, it's a better place to be than purely in the economics issue or purely in the environmental issue. And so I think we need to get back and start to think about those practical realities, because when we make policy and laws, sometimes we're not as informed as we need to be by those who have to live under them and do them. So with that, I would thank you for your attention, and I'll be here to answer questions.
Carl, thanks. That was a terrific start, I think, to our discussion. You raised an important point that always troubles me, and that is that politicians are great at setting aspirations, but they usually leave the how part out of the thing. So I remember Nixon's energy strategy, Carter's, I covered all those things, and it was always aspirations. By 2015 we'll do this, or by 2010, never told you how. And that's where we really, as voters, we have to be much more concerned. Well, how do you intend to do this? And so we see Obama's desire to reduce U.S. oil imports by a third by 2025. How are they going to do that? We see issues such as people say, we don't have to worry about coal, we've got lots of coal, and carbon capture and storage will take care of that. But we still don't have a commercially feasible system of carbon capture and storage. Are we going to get one? What price are we prepared to pay for that kind of thing? So these are, and you mentioned water. Of course, water is a big issue in the oil sands development. And the industry claims for their newer facilities that they recycle about 80%, but that still leaves 20% that doesn't get recycled. And so that's an issue of concern locally in Alberta as well. Our next speaker is Meera Fickling. And Meera, you've been here before, so you know the routine, and you gave a terrific presentation looking at what various jurisdictions were doing on climate change the last time you were here. And you're from the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington. It used to be the International Institute for International Economics, I guess, until Peterson gave them a lot of money and got naming rights. But they're doing a lot of very exciting work on these issues of energy and security and climate change. So, Meera, look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Right. I thought I'd start off with a couple of statements that might seem obvious, but just to set the framework of the debate. So this panel is entitled something like Ensuring Safe, Reliable, New Sources of Energy. And what does that mean? So in terms of safety, I guess I see two issues. One is short-term, one is long-term, and they certainly have synergies between them. In the short term, we need to develop energy without damaging human and environmental health. And recently, there have been a number of high-profile disasters that you all know about: Fukushima, the Gulf Coast oil spill, Enbridge oil spill in the Kalamazoo River in Michigan. So a sort of short-term regulatory challenge and technical challenge of how are we going to prevent these incidents from happening. And there's also water challenges, air quality challenges, and those all sort of fall under the heading of human and environmental health. And then there's a longer-term challenge that certainly falls under the same category, but it's climate change, and it's transitioning from our economy right now, which currently the United States gets about 50% of its electricity from coal, to an economy that, if you take the numbers promoted by the IPCC, we need to get to a point where we're using about 20% of the greenhouse gas emissions that we currently emit now, and that's from the developed world as a whole. So that represents a huge challenge going forward. And then on the other hand, there's reliability. Energy needs to be there when we need it. Our economy runs on energy, and firms and consumers need to be able to expect a stable price going forward. And then new energy isn't a goal in itself, but it's hard to argue that we're going to get to a point where we have safe energy, as defined by the standard of preventing climate change, of promoting human health, and reliable energy without promoting new investment. So the bottom line, again, this is kind of an obvious statement, but under the status quo, with no demand management in terms of our energy demand, and no new supply of energy, our regional dependence on outside energy supplies will rise along with prices. And second, carbon emissions will also continue to rise, jeopardizing human public health. So we need mutually reinforcing policies that promote the safety and reliability of our supplies, while also promoting, reducing greenhouse gas emissions and promoting human health. So policies needed, I'm going to go through this slide really quickly, but demand control. That includes energy efficiency and fuel efficiency. And these are policies that are generally understood to be among the cheapest, the low-hanging fruit, if you will, of climate change policy. Especially building emissions, you can get a lot of emissions reductions from new building codes without sacrificing a lot of economic growth. Same with fuel efficiency, because what you're doing is by reducing demand, you reduce the amount of money paid for these services in the first place. On the supply side, we need to increase and clean up our energy portfolio. So that's why we need a comprehensive integrated energy strategy. So energy security is obviously extremely relevant at this point with rising fuel prices. We have unrest in the Middle East, pending pipeline permits. There's a lot going on right now. But on the other hand, in the two countries, to put it mildly, this is not a calm political time. And there are many, many other political issues under which energy policy is subsumed at this point. In the United States, you have the budget debate that has consumed the political conversation for the past few months. And that has sort of a positive and a negative side for addressing energy problems. On the negative side, of course, funding for DOE, but especially EPA, is deeply cut at this point. Fortunately, energy research has actually escaped relatively unscathed from the budget process. State and local regulatory enforcement, though, has been deeply cut. And there's a lot of uncertainty as to how much money we're going to have to address these problems going forward in these agencies. On the other hand, on the revenue side, right now the focus is almost entirely on spending cuts, and nobody really wants to talk about new taxes at this point. In the next couple of years, though, I mean, currently with the budget debate that we've been having, as acrimonious as it has been, we have not been able to cut nearly as much of our pending budget deficit as is necessary by cutting discretionary spending. It's just not, it's not possible. It's not, there's no way we could put enough on the table to really make a meaningful gap in our budget deficit. So it's likely in the next couple of years, the conversation will turn to revenue. And where are we going to get that revenue? And probably the most likely solution really is doing something about the Bush tax cuts. But some people who know what they're talking about have suggested that instead of maybe raising income or payroll taxes, we might want to consider, say, a consumption tax, or under that, maybe an energy tax. So that might be on the table, even though it's not on the table right now. And of course, there's been a huge backlash against cap and trade and other sort of like regulatory measures on the stick side rather than the carrot side for dealing with renewable energy. But it could become part of the conversation going forward. Now, the second part of our political dynamic right now is the backlash against any sort of government mandate, which has really become quite extreme. And recently you have in the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee bills that passed almost unanimously, or measures rather that passed almost unanimously through the Senate a few years back, including, for example, you have light bulb standards. Whether we're going to keep on using incandescent light bulbs, or as the law dictates, move to CFL bulbs. And that's resurfacing as a huge issue in that committee. And same with initiatives for hydropower. There's an initiative that came up recently in the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee on whether we're going to fund research and competitive grants for hydropower, increase hydropower supplies in the U.S. And that was vehemently opposed by, I believe it was Mike Lee of Utah and Rand Paul of Kentucky. So these initiatives that would have gained strong bipartisan support a few years back are now, because of the political climate, very much causing heated debate. So in Canada, of course, it's also a very exciting political time. You have an upcoming election. And the election is not about energy policy, really. It's about political honesty. So you don't see the same kind of dynamic that you saw in the last election, where cap and trade was actually, and carbon tax was actually a huge issue. But it's still in the Liberal and NDP platforms have cap and trade on them. And I believe the Liberal and Conservative platforms also have some loan guarantees for hydropower projects in them. So energy is still on the table in this discussion. And it does provide some sort of uncertainty going forward as to what the government's going to look like, and by extension, what energy policy will look like going forward. And really, the most likely outcome out of this election is that we'll continue on with a minority conservative government. So it's really not necessarily clear that we're going to see a sea change in terms of energy policy, but it still introduces that level of uncertainty into the playing field. And also another dynamic that Canada has been wrestling recently with regard to energy policy is what the U.S. is going to do. Canadian exports to the United States of energy-intensive goods are huge. Canada is our biggest supplier of paper, of iron and steel, chemicals, cement, by far. And so these sectors are very important to Canada. And the question is, can Canada go at it alone and adopt its own energy policy, or will it have to follow in the U.S.'s footsteps in order to maintain economic competitiveness? And that is a major conversation that has been occurring between the Conservative Party position, which is basically that it has been for the past year and a half or so, that we can't do anything without the U.S. We have to follow in the U.S.'s footsteps. And other players, such as you have the National Roundtable for the Environment and the Economy in Canada, which has recently promoted a sort of transitional policy where Canada does a little bit more than the U.S. on the climate change file, has a slightly higher carbon tax. We don't have a carbon tax at all, so say their tax would be never exceed 20 Canadian dollars per ton past the U.S. So it would start at 20 Canadian dollars per ton, and then if the U.S. went forward, it could rise from there. And they have sort of promoted that as a way to sort of balance the competitiveness mandate and the environmental mandate without going too far to either side. So how are we doing on energy policy? There has been, on the climate change side of things, there has been some action on energy efficiency and climate change in the federal levels in both governments. But it's nowhere near what we need to reach the goals that we put forward in Copenhagen, and is not likely to come anywhere close in the next few years. In the United States, and of course both countries grapple with intense regulatory uncertainty at this point. In the United States, you have EPA regulation of greenhouse gases and criteria pollutants, which are two separate issues. And on greenhouse gases, we basically have like one big question mark at this point. Basically, as far as the EPA has gotten with this, they issued some guidance for states late last year that basically provided some sort of framework for how the states could issue new permits for new power plants and new major industrial facilities going forward. And it's necessarily very vague. Basically what they indicated is that states probably won't require power plants to use carbon capture and storage. Probably a good thing, because carbon capture and storage is not online and will not become viable probably until 2020 or later. And they will not require fuel switching in between coal and say biomass or natural gas. So, but they will require some sort of energy efficiency improvements, or they will require power plants to use the best available energy efficiency technologies. So it's really unclear at this point what exactly that means, and especially what exactly that means for the future of coal going forward. And in terms of the national regulation, the NSPS regulation, they haven't come out with that guidance yet. They probably will later this year. So that's one big question mark. Now you get to criteria pollutants, and that's where a lot of analysis has been done. Although the analysis that has been done is really all over the map. You have EPA saying that, 25 gigawatts of coal-fired power will have to be retired. That amounts to about 8% of the electricity that we get from coal. And then you have Credit Suisse and NERC, on the other hand, saying that we're going to have 60 gigawatts or 70 gigawatts retired, which is a much greater percentage. You're getting up to a fifth of our coal-fired power. So the estimates, the range of estimates on this are huge. So there's some uncertainty in those terms as well. You have fuel efficiency standards through 2016, and also in the Senate and Environment and Natural Resources Committee, there's been some discussion of a clean energy standard. If you watched Obama's State of the Union, he called for this, and meanwhile, Jeff Bingaman and Lisa Murkowski, the Democrat and Republican leader of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, have been grappling over this, and it's really not clear yet whether they're going to be able to come to a meaningful compromise on what such a standard should entail. But it is on the table right now. And in Canada, there has been some progress, although mostly a wait-and-see approach with regard to the U.S. Last summer, they announced that coal plants that will become, reach the end of their economic life by 2025 will be phased out unless they can make significant energy efficiency improvements. So that encompasses 33 out of the 51 coal plants that are currently in service in Canada. So that is a big deal. And earlier this year, Peter Kent gave a major speech at the Economist Club about Canadian energy policy going forward, and it wasn't terribly specific, but they did mention some sort of sectoral approach that might be implemented. So I guess that is also forthcoming. Much of the action right now is not in the federal government. It is at the state and provincial levels, but this has really been dwindling since a lot of these initiatives were announced, 3 or 4 years ago. For example, the WCI, when it was created in 2007, encompassed how many states? 6 or 7 states in the U.S., 4 Canadian provinces, and now it encompasses California, Quebec, and British Columbia. Ontario and Manitoba have committed to it, but they probably won't be able to start in 2012. Although, really, they have come pretty far in the sense that their legislatures have passed authorizing legislation for cap and trade. So it's pretty far along, but their regulations will not be in place in order to start on time. So you've gone from 4 Canadian provinces, several U.S. states, to 3. So that really increases the uncertainty for states that are considering implementing these kinds of programs, and really the momentum has kind of drained out of these initiatives. On the RGGI side, that has been in operation since 2008, and that encompasses a lot of northeastern states. But on that side, too, you're seeing some states threaten to pull out due to sort of electoral shifts that happened in 2010. New Hampshire's House of Representatives passed a bill pulling it out of the RGGI. So there's some uncertainty on that end as well. And you have a ton of state performance standards. I mean, renewable portfolio standards, energy efficiency resource standards that are on the table and that are doing good things. But in terms of these major economy-wide initiatives, things are really starting to stall now, even at the state level. And meanwhile, on the side of traditional energy supplies, there's a lot of doubt in terms of major sort of development initiatives. On offshore drilling in the United States, Ken Salazar has, as of this year, started to lift the moratorium on drilling permits, and there have been a couple that have now been released from that. But it's still slower than industry would like, and it's not clear exactly when that's going to speed up or if it's going to speed up. In terms of the Keystone XL pipeline, will it be approved? And that runs from Alberta over to the Gulf of Mexico in the United States. So last year, the State Department seemed to indicate that it would be approved. And then since then, you've had challenges from EPA, We've had challenges from DOE, and also, somewhat surprisingly, we've had challenges from Nebraska local politicians. And the reason for EPA and DOE has to do largely with the greenhouse gas impact. And the EPA has asked the State Department to do a more thorough analysis of what impact this will have on greenhouse gas emissions. Now, at the Nebraska level, the issue is a little bit more specific. It's the proposed pipeline route goes over a major aquifer. And meanwhile, the thickness of the pipelines, there's a lot of debate as to whether the pipelines are thick enough to contain all that oil. And prevent that oil from leaking into the aquifer. So that's become a major issue, bipartisan issue in Nebraska. So those are issues that TransCanada in building this pipeline is going to have to address with the U.S. federal government and the U.S. local governments going forward. And of course, natural gas, there's been a lot of debate over so-called fracking, which is the process of drilling into shale rock. In order to extract the gas. And there's some questions as to what that does to the water supply. There was a documentary that came out last year called Gasland that showed people turning on their faucets and being able to light them on fire. So the optics in the past year for this process haven't been the best, but so the EPA right now is conducting a study as to what effects this actually has on our water supply, and those results are pending. But shale gas drilling is, of course, expected to be a major contributor to our natural gas supplies going forward. The AEO reference case says that our natural gas supply will be 18% lower, or rather our production will be 18% lower than in the reference case if we cannot drill into shale gas. So it is a big deal what these regulations are going to be, if it's going to be regulated. So why should Canada and the U.S. cooperate on all of these issues? One is that we have, as other people have mentioned, an enormous amount of energy trade. It's just vast. Canada exports about 70% of the oil that it produces to the United States. We import about a third of our oil supply from Canada. And even electricity trade in some states and provinces is big. I think Canada exports about 10% of the electricity it produces to the United States, and some U.S. states, Vermont imports about 40% of the electricity that it consumes from Canada. Natural gas trade is also huge. The U.S. gets 90% of the natural gas that it imports from Canada. So those statistics just illustrate why we need consistent regulation in order to preserve these trade flows. And it's in the interest of both countries to develop technologies such as energy efficiency, such as maybe carbon capture and storage, that both reduce demand and allow us to expand our supply of clean energy, quote unquote, and also reduce the environmental impacts of the traditional energy supplies that we already have. And because some of the resources are cross-border, I mean, some proposed CCS injection sites are cross-border. Our grid is a very highly integrated grid. Just for practical reasons, some of these regulatory initiatives really have to be coordinated. What are going to be the standards for CCS injection? What are going to be the interoperability standards and reliability standards for any sort of smart grid that we build? So those issues really need to be addressed. So therefore, even in the face of all this regulatory uncertainty on both sides of the border, we need to address our mutual concerns. And even with this uncertainty, we can do a lot. First, resolving conflicts amongst existing actions that we already have and setting the framework for future actions. The Canada-US Clean Energy Dialogue is already accomplishing a lot of the talk. On clean energy issues, there are working groups addressing carbon capture and storage, modernizing the electric grid, working on interoperability standards, clean energy research and development, everything from algal biofuels to energy efficiency to renewable electricity. And it's a great start, and it's been producing some output, but clearly much more is needed. First, addressing trade barriers embedded in current climate legislation. California's low carbon fuel standard is something that has been really controversial in Canada for the reason that basically what it does is it creates two categories of fuels. It creates the conventional category that gets one life cycle analysis. So when firms are required to reduce their the greenhouse gas emissions embedded in their fuels by 10% in 10 years, you have this conventional basket of fuels that gets one greenhouse gas value, and then you have oil sands oil, which is going to get a higher value. And so when you look at what firms are incentivized to do to meet these standards, there's less incentive to import and refine oil sands oil. And to be fair, California doesn't really import much from the oil sands to begin with. Most of Canada's exports to the United States of oil sands oil go to the Midwest. So it's not really, California's adopting the low carbon fuel standard on its own is not a huge threat to Canada's oil sands, but it is sort of the threat of more states adopting this measure that is really concerning Canada. And so there's some legality issues with this because you're basically treating all quote unquote conventional fuels the same way, giving them the same life cycle value, and then you're singling out a few fuels that are quote unquote high carbon fuels for a higher life cycle value. So that's something that Canada has brought up. And avoiding domestic content requirements and green subsidies, there have been a number of these. One of the high-profile runs right now that has been challenged in the WTO by multiple countries is Ontario's feed-in tariff, which requires the wind turbines, et cetera, that are used to meet the standard to be produced in Ontario. But there are tons more. The stimulus bill also contains Buy American requirements. And there have been waivers negotiated between Canada and the US to address this, but there's still some stuff left out from that. US treatment of Canadian hydropower, again, like how is that going to be treated under, say, a proposed clean energy standard? Will Canadian hydropower imports count, or will they not? And this has been something that has been very much argued in terms of state standards as well. And of course, fuels, the oil sands question, which is very near and dear to Canada's heart. How will that be treated in terms of US policy going forward? So both countries need to sort of work together, both to lay an informational groundwork for future coordinated action and develop common definitions and common approaches to how they're going to conduct this policy going forward. Also, some infrastructural investments, improving transmission cross-border is going to be very important. And also investing in technologies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the oil sands is very much in both the US security interests, because we want to be importing our liquid fuels from countries that basically share our security interests, and from Canada's side because they would like to continue exporting this oil. And finally, studying options for coordinating our policies going forward, should they arise. And that concludes my presentation, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Meera. Reminds your comments about Copenhagen and the need to reduce our commitment to reduce emissions by 17% by 2020. That's only 9 years from now. Yeah. And so we're off to a slow start, and it's pretty hard for us to put pressure on the Chinese if we can't meet our own commitments. The shale gas thing is very important. There are serious environmental concerns, and there are serious environmental concerns on shale gas, and I think that what we're going to need, and I think you pointed this, is the public has to have good third-party, objective, scientific analysis, which sets out whether or not this is technologically feasible, environmentally feasible, or what kinds of regulations have to be imposed. So the public has to be able to trust the regulations. I think that's the huge challenge. We have time for a few questions, but not many, so therefore I would ask if people wouldn't mind keeping their questions very short and directing them to a particular panelist. We don't need to have each panelist answer every question. And the questioners, I hope, will include the students as well as the gray heads. So let's see, who's got the first question? And also, as Dan reminded you earlier, would you please identify yourself when you ask the question?
Hi, good morning. Marty Gelfand, Senior Counsel for Congressman Kucinich. My question is addressed to Carl Bauer. And first, I appreciate that greenhouse gas isn't the only issue. There are a lot of issues. I appreciate the depth that you went into with the water issue. We also have the toxic emissions. You brought up Japan, but we also have, the disposal of waste in nuclear power that has not been resolved and likely won't be for some time. But I wanted to get some clarification on your statement earlier in your talk about the need for a greater voice of the industry. Now, the industry, I think, has quite a voice, and it's, when we talk about some of the other issues, who's speaking for the commons? And we saw the disaster in the Gulf, and here in Ohio, there's talk about going into our state parks to drill for gas there, and there doesn't seem to be an avenue, a very good avenue in state law that has the same power as, say, NEPA at the federal level, National Environmental Policy Act. And so there doesn't seem to be much of a voice for the commons, where the industry seems to have the lion's share of the voice.
Okay. I would say that the Commons have a voice by way of election, by way of contacting their legislative representatives and senators, and both at the state and federal level. I would also say that the EPA NEPA Act applies within the state unless they've granted to the state their prerogatives on that. So I think all those things there are avenues. Whether they're adequate enough is a different discussion, or if they're understood, and we're back into the education. When you speak of the Commons, frankly, as you look at the legislative body acts, sometimes the legislative body doesn't pay attention to the Commons or the industry or whatever, or whoever's the loudest voice gets attention, and it's kind of the way our policy works, so you have to step up and be heard if you want to be heard. What I meant by the industry, though, was that instead of just laying on what should be or waiting for lobbyists to tell you what they think should be, it would be better to invite them more actively into discussions that are largely staffed by governmental, and I was one, representation from career federal staff or contractors supporting whatever executive branch agency there is, that often speak from theoretical observation and consideration without fully comprehending the experiential dimensions that they have to deal with in the day-to-day world. And especially when you talk about smaller entities in states, a lot of the independent stripper well operators, for example, they're mom and pops, they are small companies. So talking about going into the state park system for gas drilling, I think that becomes an issue of economics, and that the local body or the state body has to a degree that they're going to let anybody in there, frankly. They own the park, they own the responsibility to the citizenry. And I can't speak specifically to Ohio law about whether they have a right of calling a referendum or anything like that. But, obviously in California, that's what would happen on a case like that.
Yeah. Another question over here.
Carl, I like the idea of...
Excuse me, name?
Sorry, Tim Kennedy with Spectra, and I just wanted to start by saying I like the idea of including lobbyists in the conversation as a lobbyist, so it's an excellent idea. Guess a couple of quick points and then a question. I thought your idea about including water in terms of looking at the overall energy picture very interesting, and I'd like to see that a bit more in Canada looked at. Another point about the Western Climate Initiative, as Meera, you pointed out, Ontario just pulled out. In fact, they made their announcement the night of the national federal leaders debate. So it was a very kind of quiet, got into a little bit of media, but it's very interesting. BC is facing a serious situation, and it relates to natural gas production, which Spectra is very much involved in. We're looking at in BC a 30% increase in greenhouse gas emissions because of shale gas development. And you can see how that's going to be a major, major conflict for them as they consider their continuation in WCI, which is very unlikely. My question, Meera, is at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned how we need to develop energy in a very environmental and human health, in a responsible way that protects human and environmental health. One of the things, though, related to that I think is entirely missing in the conversation about energy development is the issue of risk. And a question to Carl, and maybe to you as well, Meera, is how do we build, or can we build, the issue of risk into our government presentations, conversations about energy production? Because it is missing. We have this polarization of, happy, friendly, renewable energy, petroleum resources, bad, ugly. I would argue very strongly that natural gas sits right in the middle. It's a huge foundational fuel. But how do we build risk, and can we do that into the government presentations about energy production? Thanks.
That's a great question. In a way, I think it's already built into a lot of the regulation. I can only speak to the United States because I'm not sure how these processes in Canada work, but a lot of the time when agencies go through with regulation, they do end up considering a number of factors, including risk to human health and risk to the economy, and certainly developing a broad framework for that is very important going forward. On the WCI, I think I've also heard about the conflict between shale gas development or gas development in BC and their environmental mandates going forward, and it's going to be a huge issue. And there's also been a change in power of the in terms of the ruling Liberal Party, and it's not really clear how the new leader is going to address the WCI going forward. So that's also an issue of huge uncertainty. So I think you're right. I think with these state and provincial initiatives, when it has come down to the wire, especially in the WCI, there's been a lot of pushback, and it has been very hard for many of these states and provinces to keep their momentum going forward.
If I could continue, yes, in the permitting process, many times there's an area of risk considered. You could ask the question by way of interpretation, then the judge of the risk may interpret it one way, and a different judge would interpret the same presentation slightly differently or even very differently. So consistency would also be what I would look for in the risk approach, which would lead it towards some more of a modeling or formulation type approach, but that's not fully satisfactory. You mentioned BC's 30% increase in CO2. What that really leads you to the question is the CO2 burden on the producer or the user? And if you think about the fact that most of BC's gas is going elsewhere, there's a CO2 release when they produce it, there's a CO2 release when it's combusted and utilized or converted to some chemical. There's still a reduction. So how does that get more properly dealt with, and who gets which piece of it as far as the total cost would be one way I would suggest to look at that in a more balanced way, which leads us to the talk of both of water and of CO2. And as we found in ethanol and some other products, as you start doing a more full-term life cycle analysis of them, you find that the numbers change radically, and even the discussion whether the numbers are correct or not, I'm not certain, because I've only looked at the paper recently from Cornell that was just released a week or so on the potential increase of gas through the methane release. So I think all those things need to be more wisely constructed, and that's one of the reasons I think that perspective needs to be brought in by those who have to live under it rather than those who are writing what they have to live under only. I don't think it should be one or the other. I think there needs to be a balance, and that's good. And then possibly even, since these things do affect the provinces and the states, which is where the real rubber meets the road, there needs to be a more active engagement of those entities in the regulatory discussion, rather than purely federal mandate that then has to be interpreted, and then we go through the court battles of interpretation because certain things weren't even thought of or understood.
I think, I hate to do this, but I think we'll have to move to our coffee break and try and keep somewhat on schedule. I think what has been interesting this morning is just to hear of the extraordinary complexity of the challenges we face, which raises a question of whether our political institutions are capable of dealing with these challenges in a timely manner. I mean, this really, ultimately, these are political decisions. And that's, to my mind, the greatest source of pessimism, is the reluctance or the inability of our institutions to come to grips with making what are very difficult decisions, which are going to create winners and losers, going to lead to price changes, all kinds of things, and trying to sort of skate by this. But, so that, as I say, does that raise, do things have to get worse before they get better? It's something to think about. I think our two panelists have given us, with great clarity, much to think about, and have started this conference at both a high intellectual level and a fairly high practical level as well. So I think we should show them our appreciation. We now have a coffee break, and